I used to believe that family obligations were invisible debts, the kind you could never fully repay no matter how much you sacrificed, which is why I was standing in the rain outside a courthouse in Portland, Oregon, staring at a wedding invitation that had somehow become the most expensive piece of paper I had ever received. My name is Mara Bennett, and for nearly 30 years I had been the daughter who solved problems quietly, paid her own way, stayed out of arguments, and accepted that my younger brother Evan would always receive the attention while I was expected to understand. Growing up in a modest neighborhood outside Portland, I learned early that my parents, Richard and Diane, measured success differently depending on which child they were talking about, because when Evan wanted something expensive, they called it an investment in his future, while whenever I needed help, they called it an opportunity to become independent. I still remembered the afternoon I was accepted into an engineering program 3 states away, only to hear my father tell me that college loans were my responsibility, and my mother suggest that working through school would teach me what comfort never could. I worked, sometimes through weekends and holidays, eventually graduating with a mountain of debt and a stubborn determination that made me promise myself I would never again depend on anyone who could use help as leverage. Years later, that determination became a career in software security, and although I wasn't wealthy enough to buy private islands or anything ridiculous, I had built a comfortable life through patience, careful decisions, and refusing to spend money simply to impress people. My relationship with my family remained polite but complicated, and whenever I returned home for holidays, I noticed the same old pattern. Evan was introduced as the ambitious entrepreneur who was destined for something huge, while I was described as the dependable one who had somehow done pretty well for herself. Then, one Thursday evening, my mother called and asked me to meet them at an upscale restaurant downtown, refusing to explain why until I arrived and found my parents sitting beside Evan and his fiancée, Chloe, with 3 folders neatly arranged on the table. My father pushed one of the folders toward me and said, "We need you to take care of something important." And when I opened it, I discovered contracts for a luxury wedding venue, a private photographer, an elaborate reception, and a guest list that looked more like a corporate conference than a family celebration. The final page showed the remaining balance, and I nearly laughed when my mother calmly explained that they wanted me to contribute $60,000 because Evan had already promised Chloe the wedding of her dreams, and someone responsible needed to make sure the promise didn't collapse. I closed the folder and asked the question that had been waiting inside me for years. When I needed help paying for my education, why was struggle supposed to make me stronger? But when Evan wants an expensive party, suddenly struggling is unacceptable. My father immediately became defensive, insisting that the situations were completely different, while my mother reminded me that Evan had a reputation to protect and that Chloe's family was expecting a certain level of celebration. Something about that sentence finally made everything clear, because they weren't asking me to help Evan build a future. They were asking me to protect an image that none of them could afford to maintain. I told them I wouldn't contribute a single dollar, and when Evan accused me of being jealous of his happiness, I calmly replied, "I'm not jealous of your wedding, Evan. I'm disappointed that you think my success gives you ownership over it." Next week became a parade of pressure, with relatives calling to tell me that family members were supposed to sacrifice for one another, old family friends suddenly appearing in my messages, and even Chloe sending me a carefully worded note saying that my decision was creating unnecessary stress for everyone. Instead of arguing, I created a simple spreadsheet showing what I had actually spent putting myself through college, what my parents had contributed, and how much they had spent supporting Evan over the same years, not because I wanted revenge, but because I was tired of being the only person expected to pretend the numbers didn't exist. When my parents saw the spreadsheet, their anger became uncomfortable silence, and for the first time my mother admitted that they had always believed I could handle more because I rarely complained while Evan seemed to need constant encouragement. I answered, "Being capable doesn't mean being available for everything," and told them that if Evan and Chloe wanted a beautiful wedding, they could create one within their own means instead of building it on a debt that belonged to me. 2 days later, Evan came to my apartment alone, without my parents or Chloe, and instead of the confident brother who had demanded my help. I found someone sitting across from me with his hands shaking slightly as he admitted that the wedding had spiraled beyond his control, because he was terrified of disappointing Chloe, and even more terrified of disappointing our parents. He confessed that he had borrowed money to keep up appearances and had been pretending everything was fine, and I told him that I would help him make a realistic budget, but I would not rescue him from consequences he had chosen for himself. That conversation changed more than I expected, because Evan called off several unnecessary bookings. Chloe agreed to replace the expensive reception with a smaller outdoor ceremony, and suddenly the wedding stopped being a performance designed for other people's approval and became something the couple could actually afford. My parents were furious at first, but when the new plan came together and no disaster occurred, they slowly realized that the only thing my refusal had destroyed was an illusion. 3 months later, Evan and Chloe married in a quiet garden outside Eugene, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about them rather than people who needed to be impressed. And I watched my brother exchange vows beneath strings of simple lights, instead of standing beneath a ceiling covered in imported flowers. My parents attended too, and although we didn't magically become a perfect family that afternoon, my father pulled me aside before dinner and said, "I think we taught you independence because we were too afraid to admit we didn't know how to be fair." I didn't forgive everything instantly, because real forgiveness isn't a switch you flip simply because someone finally says the right words, but I agreed to rebuild our relationship only if the old rules stayed behind. Walking away from that garden that evening, I realized the greatest victory wasn't refusing to pay $60,000 or proving that my parents had treated us differently. It was finally understanding that love does not require you to finance someone else's expectations, and sometimes the healthiest thing you can give your family is a boundary they never expected you to have. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.